Thanks for coming for this interview. It is an honor to have you attend the Beijingporum 2014, especially for the special session on peace and prosperity of the Korean Peninsula. The forum and this session hold relevance, particularly at a time when the many countries in the global community are in the midst of a transition due to leadership changes. And you have previously served as ambassador at large and special envoy for the U.S. State Department and was a chief negotiator of the United States during the North Korean nuclear crisis of 1994. And then I'd like to discuss your experience and the challenges during the month of tense negotiation that ultimately resulted in the agreed framework of 1994, and including, you can just repeat what you did from this, your achievement, academic achievement. And it has been 20 years. It has been 20 years since the agreed framework of 1994. For the last 20 years, the North Korean issues have become interwoven with new challenges. For example, some kind of terrorist threat. So could you briefly discuss how the United States approach toward North Korea had changed or evolved?
So I heard two questions. The first question, I think, takes me to June of 1994 and the characterization of what went on during that critical period with the North. And the second question goes to, on the one hand, what North Korea has to do with principal U.S. concerns about terrorism, on the one hand, and second, the way the United States has been approaching North Korea. So really three questions or two questions with a two-part question.
And also, you will have more questions.
So on the first issue of June of 1994, that period, May and June, was, in my recollection, very tense. Technically, what happened was that as we were looking to have another round of talks with the North did something that we explicitly warned them not to do because it would cause us great difficulty. They discharged the fuel from their nuclear reactor, the research reactor at Yongbyon, and they discharged the fuel in a way that made it impossible for the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors to track the fuel into the fuel baskets, meaning that they mixed things up so that the reconstruction of the operating history of the reactor would become impossible. We wanted them not to do that because we were, for more than a year, attempting to get to a position with the North where we could figure out how much plutonium they had actually accumulated in earlier years. And there are two ways of doing that. One is it's called at the back end, and at the back end you can examine the radioactive waste, and that desire led to the special inspections and the resistance of the North Koreans to special inspections, and therefore their withdrawal from the NPT in the beginning of our negotiations. The other way of getting at this issue was to look at the front end, and that is the reactor operating history. And it is this that the North Koreans destroyed. When Hans Blix, who was then the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, came from Vienna to New York City to the United Nations, he used this phrase I've never forgotten. He said the North Koreans have destroyed history because you couldn't recreate what they had done by mixing up the fuel elements. So that precipitated the crisis. We were intent on, we being the United States, I believe, in good alliance with the Republic of Korea and Japan, agreed that we would seek a sanctions resolution against the North in order to move the North back to negotiations on terms that we would find acceptable. The North Koreans pointed out that since there was no treaty of peace that had ended the Korean War, only an armistice, that sanctions would be a violation of the armistice and be regarded as an act of war. This got our attention, and in the United States there were some very high-level meetings about what to do about North Korea, and the President was directly involved, President Clinton, as well as the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense Perry put together a plan that would increase American military presence on the peninsula. So we were headed in that direction, just in case the North Koreans decided to make good on the implicit or explicit threat to react in a military way to a sanctions resolution from the United Nations. Now, as it turned out, we never got to the sanctions resolution because cutting across all this was an intervention by former President Jimmy Carter.
Yes.
And President Carter had an outstanding invitation from the DPRK to visit, which he had not taken up. But as the crisis heated up with the North, this looked like a situation in which intervention could help. I was sent by President Clinton and Secretary of State to brief President Carter in Plains, Georgia, and I spent the day talking to him and his wife Rosalind about the situation in North Korea. And afterwards, former President Carter decided that he would accept the offer. He would go to Pyongyang, meet with Kim Il-sung, and see if he could not defuse the crisis. This, from an American domestic political perspective, was a mixed message. It was a difficult thing for President Clinton to accept, but he did. It was a difficult thing for President Carter to do, but he did go. It subjected both men, both the current president at the time and the former president, to a great deal of criticism from those who thought talking to the North Koreans was not a good thing to do. But they both did what I regarded as their duty. President Carter had, by his presence in Pyongyang, given Kim Il-sung a face-saving way to step away from the brink, and that was extremely important at the time. Substantively, the concession that Kim Il-sung made was not that significant, but in political terms, it meant everything. And so I regarded President Carter's intervention as timely, brave, and very welcome. In American domestic political terms, it was not that. It was criticized by many, but it was the right thing to do. What we did back in Washington while President Carter was in Pyongyang, we figured out something that, in the American expression, would mean that we would raise the bar to North Korean behavior. They would have to do something extra to come back to the table to compensate for what they had done with the spent fuel. And so we told them they not only could they not reprocess or separate plutonium from the spent fuel, but we also told them that they could not restart the 5-megawatt reactor. So they could not produce any more plutonium, and they couldn't separate the plutonium either. So they'd have to essentially freeze Yongbyon. They accepted that, and that allowed us to go back to the negotiating table. We met again in Geneva for another round, and ultimately those talks after June led to the negotiation of the agreed framework in October of '94 and led away from the track we were on, which was to a sanctions resolution at the United Nations and possibly war on the Korean Peninsula. So it was a very tense time for everybody. The second of your questions went to the issue of terrorism and the relevance of the North Korean issue to American concerns about terrorism. Now, we'd always been concerned about terrorism, but after 9/11, it was, of course, the focal point of our security calculation. And you may recall that when the relatively newly elected President Bush made his State of the Union speech in 2002, he referred to an axis of evil and singled out the DPRK as 1 point on a 3-point axis.
That's along with Iran and Iraq.
Indeed. It was not lost on the North Koreans that soon after that we invaded Iraq, and we very soon after that had sanctions put against Iran. So this did, I'm sure, got the attention of the leadership in Pyongyang. The North Korean connection, I think, is most starkly made for Americans by the potential of North Korea to be the source of nuclear material or technology or even weapons to a non-national, to a terrorist group, or to a state that is known to have terrorist connections. Now, very often when I'm speaking to American audiences, it starts to sound like a spy novel, and people wonder whether I've seen too many movies or read too many books. This is not fiction. I used to be asked quite frequently of how could, since we must watch the North Koreans very closely, how could they possibly sneak out plutonium or highly enriched uranium or something to a terrorist group? And we have now the answer, because in 2007 it was revealed that North Korea had actually built a whole plutonium production reactor in Syria. One does not get much closer to international terrorism than Syria. A plutonium production reactor means it is a nuclear reactor with no purpose other than to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. It's not connected to an electrical grid or anything like that. It is for weapons production. And the North Koreans went halfway around the world to build that reactor, which is very close to being a copy of the Yongbyon reactor. After it was discovered, and it was first discovered by Israel, I understand, the Israelis decided on their own to take that reactor and destroy it. And so, much like they had destroyed a reactor in 1981 in Iraq, the Iraq reactor, they struck the Syrian reactor and flattened it. Notably, there was little to no public reaction anywhere in the world, including the Middle East and including Syria. Everybody, as we say, sucked it up. They just didn't say anything because that was clearly an illicit transfer. It was potentially devastatingly dangerous to the international community and particularly to the United States, I would say, as a likely target.
And in these days, it would be the kind of ISIS kind of strategic asset.
Exactly, exactly. So we are focused on North Korea for a variety of reasons. The most obvious to people is that constant potential for misperception, for miscalculation, as the North engages in various kinds of provocations, from sinking ships to shelling islands to doing all kinds of things. Any number of times this has happened, there's been the possibility for escalation to a conventional conflict that could be devastating, wholly apart from nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons adds another dimension to this that's quite unwelcome, of course, but there's a potential for a war that would be devastating to the Republic of Korea, to North Korea as well, I would add, and certainly to U.S. forces who are deployed in South Korea and those additional forces who would come in the event of a conflict. So we worry about that a lot. We certainly also are concerned that the nuclear weapons program in North Korea, if it continues to grow, as it has, and it's gone from a plutonium-based program to, we think, a uranium, highly enriched uranium-based program based upon transfers from the AQ-CON network in Pakistan, that this will become a political issue, if not a security issue, both in Seoul and in Tokyo in the first instance. We have formal treaty alliances with both the Republic of Korea and with Japan, and we have what is called in the security literature extended deterrence relationship with both countries. So we believe there's great virtue, value in maintaining the nonproliferation regime, the integrity of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, and we worry about damage to that regime too. So war first, that second. Third, I would say the obvious intent of the North Koreans to mate their nuclear weapons with their ballistic missiles, certainly the no-dungs in the first instance, but also variants of the Taepodung that would have intercontinental range, so they could directly threaten the United States, we are aware of and concerned about, as is, I think, everybody in the region. The Japanese have properly not been amused by having the North Koreans test their missiles over their Japanese homeland. So there's much to worry about here, much to be managed. And finally, of course, there is the character of the North Korean regime. It is, I think, arguably the most brutal totalitarian regime right now on the face of the earth. And yet, the wisest course, clearly, is to see if we cannot manage the relationship. It is not to use force against this regime. That would be, I hope, always a last resort to deal with the threat. That brings us to the second part of your of your second question, and that is, what about current policy with North Korea? Let me make a point about the setting in the United States. Negotiations with North Korea have never been popular. I felt that acutely as a negotiator 20 years ago. And if you think back in time to 20 years ago, that when in October of '94, when the deal with North Korea was struck, the agreed framework, it was only weeks after that that the midterm elections were held in the United States. The Republicans swept into power, and all of a sudden, we in the administration confronted new committees with new chairmen, who now Republicans, who were very hostile to the agreement. And my days got substantially longer back in Washington as a result of that, and more difficult. We have just gone through a period now where the Republicans did about as well as they could have in every contested case, virtually every contested case, not every. And they are firmly in control of both the House and the Senate. And I would say, therefore, that is not a solid footing for an administration to launch talks with North Korea. I don't say it's impossible. I don't say the political courage would never be there, but it's not easy. And I think it's only fair to make that point. I think there's substantial amount of skepticism in many quarters in Washington about the seriousness of the North Koreans about negotiations, whether they would in fact put their nuclear weapons program on the table for negotiations. And there's a great deal of reticence, particularly following the Leap Day experience, where the North Koreans appeared to renege on a commitment which the American side said clearly excluded rocket launches as well as missile launches, and the North Koreans, of course, denied that. So I would not say that this is the very best moment for negotiations, but as a famous international theorist once said, who was my advisor when I was a graduate student, when it's easy to have arms control negotiations, you don't need them. And so you expect, when you feel you need them, that the atmosphere is going to be difficult. And it is now. I guess one other thing I would say is that the situation with Iran is much more at center stage for the Obama administration. It's right in front of the administration. There's a deadline coming up this month. It's not to say it has to be the last deadline, but there is a deadline this month. And if the Iran situation continues to be aggravating in the international scene, it's hard for me to imagine the administration taking up a second major negotiation with the North Koreans. If, on the other hand, things appear to be going in the right direction with Iran, then maybe there might be sort of the energy and space in the bureaucracy, in the national security bureaucracy in Washington, to permit an engagement with the North. So this depends not only on the North's willingness to seriously put that program on the table, and also the ability of Washington to engage. And by the way, one final point. If the North would not put the program on the table, if the North will under no circumstances give up its nuclear weapons program, I myself would not favor negotiations. I would worry that the North was looking to legitimize its nuclear weapons status, and I think it would be a mistake to let them have that legitimacy.
Okay, thanks for your answers. And I think you have me preempted on several questions. You already passed. I have to skip the question number 2, 3, and 4. So instead of revisiting the previous questions, I'd like to jump to the number 5.
Please.
Okay, you wrote an article back in 2013 titled "Reasons to Talk to North Korea" with Stephen Borthwick at the New York Times, encouraging the Obama administration to have a direct talk with Pyongyang. But it seems that the Obama administration, the strategy has, according to New York Times, has been to largely ignore, quote, the North. What's your general advice for President Obama under the current political environment, including kind of the Republican victory in the Congress?
So I think I've already given my view that having a Republican Congress and Republicans generally and on this issue skeptical of the virtues of negotiating with the North, it will not be easy. That's the first point. I think the second point is that the administration is, how shall I say this, busy right now. There's ISIS or ISIL, which is, I think, front and center. There's the Iran negotiation, front and center. The Ebola crisis, maybe it's ebbing, but it's also very much on the radar screen of the administration. So, and by the way, the Russian situation with Ukraine is another one which could, at any point, could become the first crisis. So there's a lot right now going on. And notwithstanding our pivot to Asia, these things are crises right now. And at this moment, one would not say in Washington terms the North Korean situation is a crisis. That said, I think the American perspective is that unlike fine wine, the situation with North Korea does not get better with the passage of time. That as time goes on, the North Koreans accumulate more fissile material, make more nuclear weapons, test more, sharpen the accuracy and ability to mate those weapons with ballistic missiles, do more ballistic missile tests, have opportunities to have more provocations with the South, and continuing the possibility of a war. So one doesn't want to diminish the significance of the problem on the Korean Peninsula. It's just that there are a lot of other things going on right at this same time. And you have the domestic problem of the context being, let's say, unwelcoming to a diplomatic initiative with the North. On the other hand, if we can get by the Iran situation and the other problems don't dominate the president's time and the time of everyone in the national security bureaucracy, I think there's a case to be made that the best way to improve this situation, if not to solve the problem, but to improve the situation, would be direct negotiations with the North. I have never been committed to any particular modality. Some of my colleagues strongly favor six-party talks. Others of my colleagues want bilateral talks. To me, this doesn't make a lot of difference. There are certain things about talks that should be true. One, the Americans must be present because we present a security threat for which the North Koreans have acquired the nuclear weapons in the first place. Second, the presence of at least the Republic of Korea, China, and I think Japan is essential. The presence doesn't have to be in the room at the same time as the United States is talking with the North Koreans. Indeed, when there are six-party talks, nothing gets done with 100 people in the room. It gets done in bilaterals. And when we had a bilateral negotiation 20 years ago, there wasn't a day, there was never a day that I would meet with the North without also meeting with the South, and not the Chinese every day, and not the Japanese necessarily, but every time I met with the North, I met with the South, the diplomats who were in Geneva, traveled frequently to Seoul, and also to Tokyo and to Beijing. So a multilateral resolution is required, but steps can be made bilaterally, I think, without a problem. I'm relaxed about the modality. I don't think that's that important. What's most important is that the North Koreans come to the table, as Koreans like to say, sincerely interested in a settlement.
Okay, and actually I cannot agree with you more over this issue. Ashton Carter, one of my professors at the graduate program, said that no administration can handle more than two crises. We already have Ebola, we have Ukraine/Russia thing, and we have ISIS in the Middle East, and Iranian nuclear negotiation is going on. So it is not kind of a third crisis. It would be the fifth crisis. And also, as you said, we have some kind of the pivot to Asia. This is a kind of emerging crisis in East Asia. However, as you said, the necessity of negotiation with the North Korean is inevitable. Then we have another challenge. Is almost a decade. Many Americans, diplomats and negotiators and academics, have been arguing that Washington would not be fooled by Pyongyang for a third time. And then, do you think it is likely to have another agreement over North Korea's nuclear program? Yeah.
So, you may or may not know this, but Americans love bumper stickers. And we love bumper stickers, I think, because we like short, simple answers. Yeah. And if the answer is very long, it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. So the bumper sticker answer to what do we do about North Korea is we're not going to buy that horse again. That's right. And what people mean by that is a version of what you said in your question, which is the perception some have that they've tricked us 3 times. I don't think we were tricked once, never mind 3 times. I think that we knew what we were doing in 1994. I'm pretty sure I knew what I was doing. People have tried subsequently to say things like, and this was thrown at me just recently on the anniversary of the framework, you only made that deal because you thought the regime would crash and burn before you had to implement the deal. I don't know what is in other people's mind. I do know what was in my mind, and I never made that deal, never signed that agreement on behalf of my country, only because I thought the regime was going to crash. And that deal was intended to be in the national security interests of our allies and ourselves, whether or not the regime crashed and burned. So that was one proposition. Another is that we were tricked. Well, I was asked over and over again, will the North Koreans cheat? And my answer was, I don't know. I do believe that if they cheat in any way that's significant, we will find out. And we did. They did cheat, that is, and we found out. And eventually, the framework collapsed. We did get some good outcomes from that. There is no stockpile of plutonium. There is no stockpile of plutonium-based weapons. There are some, we think, I don't know, 5 or 10, but not a couple of hundred. And that is directly the result of the framework. So I don't think the framework was a mistake. I think it was an agreement that was deeply and profoundly in the interest of national security of our allies, Japan and Korea and ourselves, and good for Northeast Asia and good for the world. But it did collapse, and I believe the North did, as we say, cheat on the deal. What about 2005, 2007? More possibilities for a deal. A stumbling block clearly with the North Koreans will be the verification provisions that we will insist upon. And I think when I say will the North Koreans put their nuclear weapons program on the table, I mean put it on the table, make a deal, and accept verification measures so we know they're abiding by the deal. So the question of the bumper sticker-like language of we won't do this again needs to be countered by people speaking slowly and deliberately about what actually happened. We have not been snookered. We haven't been shocked that North Korea wouldn't abide by agreement. We're quite aware that there were going to be difficulties. We never thought of North Korea as Canada. We understood that this was a different country with its own perception of what its self-interest required, and we needed to work with that. Would be still prepared to do it if the North Koreans were prepared to put their weapons program on the table for negotiation.
Yes, I understand your kind of achievement, and also I agree with you. At least the agreed framework achieved to, let's say, to freeze the North Korean nuclear program, at least with the plutonium-wise. But under the current circumstances, especially for the couple of years, there has been some kind of speculation that Pyongyang's recent provocations not only target the U.S. and South Korea, but also China to show or to kind of demonstrate its political or the military independence in many ways. So what are your thoughts on this kind of speculation?
I must say I'm confused by the proposition that North Korea can demonstrate its independence by engaging in provocations against the South. First, there's no way it can demonstrate its independence because it's not independent. It is deeply and profoundly dependent on Beijing, and Beijing has extraordinary influence over Pyongyang. However, both Beijing and Pyongyang are aware that Beijing does not wish to see that regime collapse as a result of being strangled by sanctions. So Beijing's willingness, in my view, to pressure the North into reasonable behavior is limited by its concern that that regime not fall. On the other hand, when the North does things which are provocative, which could result in conflict on the peninsula, which can raise the question of sovereign states like the Republic of Korea and Japan deciding that they maybe ought to have their own nuclear weapons, none of this would be good news for Beijing. So they don't need provocations from the North. They don't need a reaction that brings more military naval presence of the United States into Northeast Asia. They don't need Japanese and South Korean nationalism to be provoked by threats from the North. So it seems to me that China is in something of a bind. They have, I think, tried to walk a careful line here, making sure that the North Korean regime doesn't collapse on the one hand. On the other hand, trying to make sure that the North Koreans understand that China does not wish to see conflict on the peninsula. So it's a difficult thing for the Chinese. If I've got this figured out right, don't know that I have, but I think I have. And all that suggests to me is that the best route, the best course forward for Seoul, Tokyo, Washington, and Beijing is for us to continue close consultations in how we deal with the North. I think breaking us off, if the North Koreans could do that, would be damaging to us. If we went off on our own separate way in dealing with the North, which would be, I think, legitimizing for their weapons program, would not be good. I think presenting a pretty solid front, I think encouraging the Chinese to be even a tad more aggressive with the North, to try to get the North into a more reasonable position, would be the best course forward.
Thank you. And in South Korea's kind of academic / the policy making the discussion, we have a debate whether China's kind of strategic priority about Korean Peninsula has changed. For example, the one group believe that still the number one priority of Beijing is stabilization of the North Korean regime. And the other group believe that China is, as you said, is a kind of working the very close line, and also China's priority changed from the stability in North Korea toward some kind of a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So which opinion do you find more kind of accurate in these days?
I have a hard time separating those into distinct goals. It seems to me that the Chinese clearly want stable Northeast Asia. I can't see how anything else could be in China's national security interest. That means a number of things. I think it has territorial concerns with one or another state, many states, South China Sea issues. There's always the resolution of the status of Taiwan as an issue for it. Right now, we're talking about the Korean Peninsula. The Chinese, I think, want to deal more successfully with their relations with Japan, and I think that there's some news there that it may be encouraging. Obviously, Beijing-Seoul relations are on a solid economic footing. It's quite impressive what's happening in terms of trade between these countries. So managing the North Korean situation and the nuclear element of that, which drives a lot of the problems we see, is extremely important. I can't see separating these things out for the Chinese. I think this is essentially, as they say, one coherent whole. They need to do it all. They need to manage the North Korean behavior in terms of how it attempts to get the attention of the international community with the one asset it has, which is the capacity to cause danger, risk, and with threats of various kinds and provocations, to manage that on the one hand, and two, not get it into a situation in which there's a dramatic collapse or a conflict on the peninsula. So the nuclear weapons program the Chinese have certainly understood is an enormous source of concern for everyone, but the United States probably is in the lead in this connection. We really do see this as a threat to the whole international community, but in the first instance, a threat to the peace and stability in Northeast Asia. The United States and China on this issue have not exactly congruent interests, but really certainly overlapping interests.
Okay, as you said, North Korea is a kind of North Korea is already dependent upon China for a lot of reasons. But if Beijing began to flex its diplomatic muscle over Pyongyang, then what would happen over the North Korea's or the Korean Peninsula's diplomatic environment? We already have another bipolar system in East Asia, I guess. So then, isn't it kind of a confirmation of China's supremacy in this area?
I don't know this for sure, what I'm about to say, but it would be my view that there's room for China to exert greater pressure on the North, and for the Kim Jong-un and that regime in Pyongyang to recognize that their survival as a regime would ultimately depend upon the delivery of basic services of a government to its people. And the Chinese have the capacity to put that at risk. If the North Koreans saw that was something the Chinese were willing to do and could escape that risk by entering into negotiations with the five parties, that just
five parties, the six-party talks.
In the six-party talks, so they would. This might be the way to go. It requires the Chinese to make a very calculated decision about increasing the pressure, unless the North does it all by themselves. I mean, we very often mirror image in the United States, and I'm sure other countries do this too, and do a kind of cost-benefit analysis. And when we do this and look at the North Korean case, we don't see the North Koreans as drawing the right conclusion from their cost-benefit analysis, which should suggest to us that mirror imaging is not a good idea, or that we have risk propensities off, or that we've put the wrong values on the cost and the benefit. Something's not happening right here. And one of the things that's not happening is the North does not seem to have the same kind of concern for the well-being of its people, the regime in the North, as we would expect it to. So it certainly has a concern for its own survival as a regime, and putting that at risk, something that China can do. Whether they're prepared to do that, I do not know. But that may ultimately be necessary to bring to the North to the table in a reasonable way.
Yes, and then kind of replying to your answer, if the China want to put pressure upon the North Korea's kind of ability to sustain itself as a regime, then isn't it kind of undermine the China's effort to stabilize North Korea? And then we guess that there might be some kind of trade-off between China's priorities, the sustaining or the stabilizing North Korea on the one hand, and kind of stabilizing the local or the East Asian situation by kind of diffusing a third or the fourth of North Korean nuclear crisis.
Yeah. The dynamic you're going to here could sort of as the other side of the coin for China, I guess. If the Chinese believed that a stable North Korea was profoundly in China's interests, then they wouldn't want to put so much pressure. And this would make good sense to me as a calculation were the Chinese not pursuing an aggressive nuclear weapons program and ballistic missile program. That this seems to me to cause instability on the peninsula, threatens Japan, certainly threatens the United States of America, and so China looks at these North Korean policies and says the price of sustaining the North Korean regime is to create a security crisis in Northeast Asia that has South Korea, Japan, and the United States looking for ways to respond. This is not good news for China. So that I think the structure you were laying out makes good sense if North Korea did not have a provocative security posture. But it is creating a situation in region-wise which is, I think, untenable for the Chinese.
Okay, thank you. Kind of this is a courtesy question, last but not the least. And this year's theme of Beijingforum is harmony of civilization and prosperity for all. China and the world, tradition, reality, and the future. So as a long-time U.S. ambassador and negotiator and diplomats, what do you think are the most critical diplomatic skills out of your experience required to achieve the harmony of civilizations and the prosperity for all?
That's a great question, and I'm not up to a great answer, but I will say that I think it's certainly true of Americans, probably of others as well, that a certain degree of humility is probably a good thing for any diplomat proposing to represent his country in the international arena, particularly if he or she is dealing with issues of international security. That being humble about what we know, being cautious about what we try to manipulate and manage would seem to be the proper body posture approach to these very, very complicated issues about which we can only know a limited amount. And I think the cure for our ignorance in this is probably better education. It's probably trying to understand other cultures more profoundly than we normally do. And I say this as an American because we probably are less good at that than others, but we find ourselves, we think for the right reasons, present in many regions. We think trying to do what's right in those regions, but it's very demanding on our appreciation for the complexities of the cultures of other countries, the histories of other countries. So I would stick to my first proposition that humility is probably an essential component of good diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of KFAS, the Korean Foundation for Advanced Studies, I truly appreciate your participation at this interview.
Thank you very much.